Okay, good afternoon. I'll try again. Good afternoon. Hello. Welcome. It is just lovely. I just want to remark real quick how wonderful it is to see a full room for an event in person, live and in person after COVID. I know it's in our rear view, but it's so nice to be together. Thank you all for coming out. Welcome to UIC Urban Forum 2025, the power of community engagement, building bridges for shared impact. Urban Forum is an annual event that brings together a wide array of stakeholders for critical analysis and discussion on a topic of important relevance to cities and urban areas. I am Joe Horath. I'm director of the Urban Forum, program director of the Urban Forum. I am also director of the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement, which is in the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs. And Urban Forum is one of the many efforts that we support that bring together people in discourse on current urban issues. So thank you all for coming out to what hopes to be a really great conversation. Before introducing our chancellor, who will open up the program, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement. In the spirit of building a better future and healing, we'd like to acknowledge that we are on land that indigenous peoples have inhabited since time immemorial. With the intention of progressing institutional practices that honor and support Native peoples, we must first acknowledge the original peoples of the Chicagoland area, the Three Fires Confederacy, Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, as well as other tribal nations that know this area as their homelands, including the Menominee, Ho-Chunk, Miami, Peoria, Sac, and Fox. Chicago is the current home to one of the largest urban Native American communities in the United States, and it was primarily a primary relocation site during the mid-20th century as a result of federal policies aimed to terminate tribal communities and sovereignty. Native people are part of Chicago's past, present, and future. As part of a land-grant university system that occupies and benefits from the theft of indigenous lands, we have responsibility to Native American community members at UIC in Chicago, within the United States, and around the world. Acknowledging is doing, and UIC offers in-state tuition at our undergraduate levels to Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Indigenous Pacific Islanders, as well as unique housing grant for out-of-state undergrads. We intend to do more to increase visibility, support, and partnership with Native communities here at UIC, and expect to create tangible and ongoing changes in policy and action to build a community with Native people that privileges their voices around our shared flame. Okay, I want to make a quick announcement here before I introduce our chancellor. The QR codes that you may see in your program, there's a problem with those, so I understand we have QR codes at the table, so if you use those work. Of course, you could just read the printed program, but if you want to use your device, which I know many of us do and appreciate, the QR code at your table works. All right, it is now my pleasure to introduce UIC's Chancellor, Dr. Marilyn Miranda, to open our program. A nationally renowned leader in higher education and an expert in geospatial health informatics, Chancellor Miranda leads Chicago's largest and only public research university, UIC. She's also a faculty member of both the Department of Pediatrics and the Department of Mathematics, Statistics, and Computer Science. Chancellor Miranda trained at Duke and Harvard universities, and she is a fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science. She actively participates in Chicago's civic life, serving on various national and local boards, and is deeply committed to the role of UIC in more equitably shaping Chicago, Illinois, and the world. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor Marilyn Miranda.
Thank you, Joe, for that very warm introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to be here to open the 2025 UIC Urban Forum, although I guess Joe opened it for the person who opened it, and then I'll pass it off to the Dean of Cuppa, who will really open it. So this is like the many-layered, the box within a box of gifts. So on behalf of UIC, I extend my gratitude to our distinguished keynote speakers, panelists, and presenters. Your insights and expertise are needed during these challenging times. I'm delighted to see so many faculty, staff, and students from both UIC and neighboring institutions. When I see a room full like this, it is such a great reminder of the entire purpose of universities. So thank you for reminding me of our purpose by being here today. The strong representation from partnering foundations, corporations, local government, civic, and nonprofit sectors underscores the essential theme of today's forum to build bridges and maximize our collective impact. I'd like to express our gratitude to our sponsors, UIC's College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement, Vocalo, and WBEZ Chicago. Thank you for caring about the future of Chicago and the many wonderful communities we proudly serve. UIC's mission is to provide the broadest access to the highest levels of educational research and clinical excellence. We are Chicago's only public research university with a powerful legacy of social justice that builds on the work of legendary social reformer Jane Addams. We are a minority-serving institution. 56% of our students are Pell Grant recipients. Roughly half of UIC's student body is made up of first-generation college students, and our clinics and hospitals focus on the most underserved communities in Chicago and across the state. At the same time, our faculty compete their ideas nationally and internationally and annually land approximately $500 million in research funding. We are all about access and excellence and have shown that both can be achieved simultaneously in the same place. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. It makes sense then that UIC has been at the forefront of addressing the challenges and opportunities facing 21st century cities. For 30 years, the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs has helped to positively transform cities by engaging with communities, partnering to enhance conditions and shared prosperity, and providing policy solutions at all levels of government. We do not just describe problems, we provide solutions to problems. This includes research on wage theft, transit equity, school closures, racial disparities, water rates, unemployment, and regional development, work that influences how and where public and nonprofit revenues are allocated, and how communities can determine their own futures with the data, tools, and options that grow out of our partnerships. Importantly, community engagement has been at the heart of Cuppa's work, perhaps best exemplified by projects like the City Design Charrette and our urban planning studios, both of which involve extensive community engagement and participatory strategies for urban design solutions. Guided by our Great Cities commitment, UIC is fostering civic engagement and innovative research that has a direct impact on policy and practice in Chicago and beyond. We do that work especially so in Cuppa, but also across our campus and in collaboration with organizations across the city, state, country, and globe. The theme of this year's forum, the power of community, the power of community engagement, building bridges for shared impact, is very timely. We are living through a period marked by complex social, economic, and environmental challenges, all happening within the context of highly polarized political environments. This forum brings together experts, practitioners, and community leaders who are working to meet this moment. At UIC, we are resolute about our mission and values, and they guide every decision we make, especially so in these challenging times. We are counting on this group to make our city more vibrant and resilient, and to do that guided by a mission and by values. thank you very much for being here. I regret I have there, you may have heard things are a little busy for universities right now. I wish I could stay the entire day because this is exactly the type of stuff that makes my mind really happy. I'm going to have to leave after a little bit, and I apologize for that. You're in for a wonderful day. Thank you so much for being here. And now it falls to me to introduce the Dean of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, Stacy Swearingen-White. Now, if I were really a good chancellor, I would have like the details of her experience and the things and all of that. I could do that, but I think I can do the thing that's even better when I say Stacy is one of our strongest, most dynamic, and innovative deans, and we are so very grateful to have you on our campus.
All right. Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for coming to the 2025 Urban Forum. This has been a long time in coming, and I woke up today thinking, it's here, it's here. It's a great day. So you've already heard from Dr. Joe Horath a little bit about the history of the forum, and we've just heard from our chancellor, Dr. Marilyn Miranda, about UIC's commitment to community engagement and our role as UIC as a key anchor institution in Chicago. Now I have the honor of talking about someone who helped reinforce, embed, and center the idea of community engagement and anchor institutions at this university. His name is David Perry. David came to UIC in 1997. His influence here and on his many academic colleagues and university partners in Chicago and around the world made a profound impact in how urban-based research is designed and conducted. The scope of David's research led to lasting contributions to higher education and a clear notion of engaged research, and also a recognition of the positive roles anchor institutions can play. The term co-designed research sat at the periphery of scholarly work for years until David and several of his closest academic colleagues, some of whom are here today, led universities in reconsidering their relationship with the communities in their neighborhoods and around the globe. David believed that scholars should not approach broader communities as objects of their research. Instead, he asserted that research questions and goals should be designed with partners in communities. So he believed that urban research should be conducted with people, not on people. After serving for almost 13 years as director of the Great Cities Institute in Cuppa, as Associate Chancellor for the university's Great Cities Commitment, and as a professor of urban planning and policy, David retired in 2018. He passed away this past December in 2024. David's legacy lives on in the engaged research that we will hear about today at the forum. David and his wife, Judith Kasi, were also very generous in setting up the David Perry Fund for Engaged Scholarship, and we're so grateful to them and know that academics, partners, and neighbors will continue to work together to make our world more just, resilient, and livable for everyone. Judith Kasi and Evan Perry are here with us today. I see them. So please join me in showing our ongoing appreciation. And then today, let's let ourselves be inspired by this commitment to engaged research. It's only fitting that our first panel this afternoon was organized and will be facilitated by Dr. Teresa Cordova, who serves now as the director of the Great Cities Institute, celebrating over 10 years in that leadership role. She's also a professor of urban planning and policy. GCI and Cuppa were born together in 1995, so we're both celebrating 30-year anniversaries this year. And this panel, which is titled Reflecting on the Commitment to Build Great Cities, is a fitting tribute to David Perry and the work that GCI and Teresa continue to lead. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cordova and have her come to the stage to introduce her panelists and set the stage for their conversation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Teresa Cordova.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
What a great crowd. And as Vim Vivel and Phil Neiden are coming up, I also want to note that, and you'll hear about it, is Vim's role in the creation of the Great Cities Commitment, the Great Cities Initiative, and he was also the first director of the Great Cities Institute. But you will hear more about that. So good afternoon, everyone. I am Teresa Cordova, Director, Great Cities Institute, and as has been said, Professor of Urban Planning and Policy. I'm joined by Phil Knighton, Professor Emeritus Sociology and Founding Director of the Center for Urban Research and Learning, better known as CURL, at Loyola University here in Chicago. Wim Wiewel, a leader in higher education and urban development, first director of Great Cities Institute, College of Urban Planning, and the first dean of the College of Urban Planning and Policy, and former president of both Portland State University and Lewis Clark College. So it's sort of a big deal that you're here, Wim, and we thank you for traveling from Portland to be here. We are happy and honored to be here today to share with you some insights based on our experiences on how community-engaged research can inform urban agendas. We will also reflect on the history of the Great Cities program at UIC, university community partnerships in general, and we will revisit strategies described in the 1991 book, Challenging Uneven Development, an Urban Agenda for the 1990s, that Phil and Wim edited, and in which I wrote a chapter on community efforts to oppose gentrification. I would also like to acknowledge John J. Betancourt, who also had a chapter in this book. In the 1980s, cities were reeling from the impacts of the dramatic loss of jobs in a key sector of the economy. In Chicago, for example, at its height in 1950, there were 668,000 manufacturing jobs. In 1980, the number dropped to 277,000. In addition to the massive job loss was the loss of the city's population, disinvestment from neighborhoods and loss of institutional anchors, and the disruption of long-standing communities. Simultaneously, government coffers were shrinking, making it more difficult to address the city's needs. This is the Chicago that Harold Washington and his team inherited as they took office in 1983. A hostile majority in the city council, referred to as the Council Wars, made addressing the city's issues even more difficult. Nonetheless, community organizations and development corporations were elevated and resourced to help build neighborhoods. Economic development initiatives jump-started dollars flowing through the economy, and subsidies were used to try to stem the further loss of industry. By the 1990s, after the death of Harold Washington and the end of the reform movement, manufacturing jobs were still in decline, with only 172,000 jobs in 1995, replaced by occupational segmentation and the beginnings of chronic joblessness. From 1970 to 1990, the population in Chicago dropped by nearly 600,000 people, and the urban restructuring of this period was aptly described as uneven development. Urban observers knew that this uneven development needed to be challenged and that an articulation of strategies was warranted. Several academics had been part of the community development urban planning efforts of the 1980s. Rob Meir, a professor of urban planning and policy at UIC, was foremost among them, and included researchers at the Center for Urban Economic Development, founded by Rob, and then directed by Wim Wiewel, when Rob became Commissioner of Economic Development in the Washington administration. Researchers at Kiewit assessed the dynamics of urban restructuring, industrial retention strategies, and job training for displaced faculty workers. It was in this context that Wim Wiewel and Phil Knighton came together through the impetus of the MacArthur Foundation to host a forum in September 1989. I and other authors in this book, The Challenging Uneven Development, presented at this forum. On the heels of this conference, still with the support of the MacArthur Foundation, several of us, again with the leadership of Wim and Phil, came together to form the Policy Action Group known as PRAG, which they're both going to talk about, to further enhance the capacity for engaged research with policy value. We are here today to share some of that history and to reflect on what and how university research can be of value to urban planning and policy making. I turn first to Wim, who will present thoughts on the origins of the Engaged University and the context and history of the formation of the Great Cities Initiative at UIC. As the former president of 2 universities, he will provide some reflections on the value of this research to communities. Through Phil's highlights on the formation of Prague and his founding in the late 1990s of Curl at Loyola University, we learn about the crosstown collaboration that occurred among academics in Chicago during this period. I will then present some highlights of the current work of the Great Cities Institute and how it reflects the continued legacy of how university researchers can work with a range of stakeholders to produce meaningful and relevant research to address pressing urban challenges. We will then have a brief discussion among ourselves about some of those challenges, and we will open up the floor for questions from you. I turn first to Wim.
Thank you, Teresa. And you know, who could resist an invitation to come to Chicago on a lovely spring day? We even had some snow yesterday. I was very glad to see that because it confirmed my decision to move to Portland. But nonetheless, I love being back here, and I love UIC, and I was here for 25 years, and I will be forever grateful for the opportunities that this institution and this city gave me to understand what American cities are about. Now, this idea of university-community partnerships or university-engaged research, on the one hand, certainly got a whole new boost in the 90s. But at the same time, that was not entirely fair because, of course, universities have in many ways often been integrated with the communities that they serve. Indeed, when they were first founded, both in Europe and in the United States, you know, their main role was to train the clergy for service in the church communities, later training lawyers and doctors and so on. In the 1870s, the land-grant universities, which the University of Illinois is one of, were established as early as the 1870s to really help the agricultural production of the country, and they worked very closely with their relevant community, the farmers around the country, as well as with factory production. So they were deeply engaged with that community. In the 1920s, John Dewey at University of Columbia University, who saw a bit of a regression of universities towards an ivory tower kind of nature, called for universities to be more practical and pragmatic, and very much promoted the notion that while book learning is all good and well, that you learn best by doing, and that became a big part of educational philosophy in the following years. And of course, in the 1950s and 1960s, universities were absolutely critical to the expansion of scientific research, the space race, the arms race that the United States was involved in. So very much in touch with what was deemed to be necessary at a national level. Now, it's also true that during those years, starting so in the beginning of the 20th century, but continuing deep into it, many colleges and universities had serious town and gown problems. In small towns, they could be particularly visible, everything from the pranks of undergraduates to the university's need for land and space. That really expressed itself with some of the big urban universities that, as they got more funding for scientific research in the 50s and 60s, scientific research, you need labs, you usually need new buildings. So it led to a real building boom for universities, which meant that the surrounding communities were often the place where universities would be eyeing space for expansion. Combine that with the baby boom, which led to an enormous growth in the size of universities, it led to expansion everywhere. And of course, this campus is precisely an example of that, created in the mid-60s, moving from Navy Pier, where it was first located after World War II, and then coming here and displacing The numbers vary, but a large number of both residents and businesses in the old Italian and Jewish communities that were located here. Later, the fights that Columbia had with the Morningside community when it wanted to build its new gym, the University of Chicago in its relationship with Woodlawn, and us right here, Harvard and Alston. The examples are actually numerous. Now, so during that same time, though, especially in the 80s and 90s, universities began to work more with their surrounding communities. And I think there were a number of motivations to do this. First one, frankly, was clear self-interest, that, well, by working with the community, we'll have a better relationship with the community, so perhaps they won't give us so much grief. Indeed, I remember having one community organizer from the West Side, when we came to talk to them about what, as a university, we might do with them, he said, I don't want to have anything to do with you because you'll just use this as an argument to get your zoning changed and take over my land. So he was perhaps hip to at least one of the motivations that universities may have had. But at the same time, there was also new definitions of scholarship. Ernest Linton and Ernest Boyer, started to talk about engaged research. Again, sort of harking back to Dewey, the idea that by working out in the community, that there were different sources of knowledge. University people, faculty and students might have one source of knowledge, but community people had another kind of knowledge. And that by putting those together, we would all be better off. It was also a response to the urban crisis. Teresa mentioned some of those numbers. While we had a lot of urban focus and model cities programs and so on during the 60s, during the 70s and 80s, the presidencies of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, we essentially had benign neglect, so to speak, not a lot of focus on cities. We also had tough times with state budgets. Now, I have to admit that in having worked for public universities for 35 years, I think I can only remember one year where we didn't have problems with the state budget, but it was particularly severe during the 80s, and we needed to show to the state and to legislators that, in fact, public universities were very important to the state's well-being, its economy, and its people, and so on. There was also, culturally, the rise of community empowerment. Of course, it was most visibly reflected in the creation and rise of the Harold Washington Coalition here in Chicago, which brought together the Black, Latino, and progressive white communities. For the first time, I was able to make a big change. So the other thing why there was a motivation to do this here, specifically at UIC, that in '93 we had a brand new chancellor, Jim Stuckel, but he had previously been the vice chancellor for research. So he had very much been in charge of creating UIC, which resulted from the merger, right, of Chicago Circle with the University of Illinois at the Medical Center in '83, to show that we could be a research university on a par with our sister institution in Urbana-Champaign. But we also had this historical urban mission, which nobody was exactly clear over what that meant. It certainly meant being an access university, serving a broad range of people, and being engaged that way. So he felt that by combining this research push and the urban mission, combining access and excellence, as the words are that the chancellor just mentioned, that we could create a new kind of university. And we called that the Great Cities Commitment, starting in 1993. Again, we were also fortunate that that coincided with a renewed interest in cities. As recently as 1991, Newsweek had a cover story saying, and it had sort of a picture of urban decline, and it said, "Are cities obsolete?" Now, of course, it turned out that it was Newsweek that was obsolete because they went out of business, at least on the printed edition, not too long after that. But there was a new commitment to cities. My colleague Joe Persky, who was in the economics department, and I wrote a paper for the Brookings Institution called "Does America Need Cities?" And it made the argument why, for economic reasons, cities were really where creativity was taking place. More patents, more innovation. And that was really the beginning of the, not our paper so much, of course, but the beginning of a new time of growth and well-being for cities. So the Great Cities Initiative, which started in 1993 and then created the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, created the Great Cities Institute, created the UIC Neighborhoods Initiative, a partnership with the Near West Side and Pilsen, the City Design Center, health policy centers, and many other activities, building, of course, on the work that had been going on for a long time in the Center for Urban Economic Development, the School of Social Work, School of Education, and the health colleges. But it was a way to mark, highlight, make visible, and it became part of a nationwide movement that really strengthened engaged university research that we're still seeing the fruits of today. And with that, I will turn to my colleague Phil Knighton, who I worked with so closely during those years, and who will talk about how some of that took place in the city. Phil, thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I wanted to thank Teresa and Great Cities and all the other pieces of the urban mission of this university for setting up this panel and this day. In 1992, Vim and I co-authored an article for the American Sociologist, and it was entitled Collaborative Research, Harnessing the Tensions Between Researcher and Practitioner. And we noted at the beginning, although research can be a powerful resource in guiding and fueling grassroots social change, the community-based enterprise has often been as tumultuous as the community-based change it seeks to spawn or encourage. I think many of us have experienced those kinds of things. And we also noted in the same article that, that basically over 55 years ago now, reflecting the disdain for most universities' researchers, one of the quintessential community activists based in Chicago at many points, quintessential community activists in the 20th century, Saul Alinsky, tersely commented that the word academic was a synonym for irrelevant. He said other things that were rather earthy, but I won't go into those here. So, I mean, as was mentioned earlier, is that the kind of research we're talking about here, and the model developed by Prague and has been used by Great Cities and other universities more recently, has been this work with basically doing research with communities, not on communities. And what this means, among other things, is that communities involved is setting the research topics, the agendas, not just going to the community and saying, how about working with me on this? And also, so the issue of developing that, also involved in even data collection and analysis. Activists, activists and academics routinely are involved in an active discussion, in many ways very similar to what traditional universities have, where there's debates, there's disagreements, there's arguments, and in a sense, what we're doing is adding chairs to the research table. And I think what's happened in the 80s and 90s, what happened here in Chicago, was a process of institutionalizing much of this. And we've mentioned that the MacArthur Foundation was involved early on with this. There was actually a series in the paper, Chicago Tribune, Chicago on Hold, which promoted downtown development and forget about the neighborhoods. At that time, MacArthur, and they still do, had made many investments in local communities in Chicago, very significant investments. So they were looking at a way of answering that. So rather than doing a survey, Vim and I were both at this meeting of about 12 folks. Rather than doing a survey defending themselves, we suggested, and they did, work on initiatives to actually build the connections between the knowledge in the community and knowledge in universities, and bring it together where often they're clashing. And so that's the 10 papers came out of that in large part, and out of that came through a long, sort of not a long process, but a few years, was basically, again, putting together all the stuff, and we developed this group called the Policy Research Acting Group Prague. There are a few folks in the audience that were involved with that. Maureen Hellwig, for example, is one of the past coordinators of Prague. And this served through, from the early 1990s through 2003, but basically routinized working collaborative relationships between universities and community organizations. It involved 4 universities, UIC, DePaul, Loyola, and Chicago State. And it was also produced hundreds of collaborative projects over the years and has significant foundation support from MacArthur. Ironically, a fairly large support from the U.S. Department of Education on a massive program that was in fact passed by a bipartisan legislature in Congress and was signed by a Republican president. Things have changed. Prague used this collaborative research team model. So team members included community activists, faculty, graduate students, undergraduates, community scholars, and learning was happening in multiple directions. We used to reference that it was research with a constituency, that it wasn't just a paper for a course, it wasn't a dissertation that would sit on a shelf, but these products did things. And the goal was to have an impact on communities, not just reports to academic disciplines. And it wasn't governed by the needs of an academic discipline, it was governed by the needs of local communities. And also, you gain understanding in the political dimensions of research. The idea that research isn't political is nuts. I mean, it is. I mean, whether it's implicit, whether it's active, but it certainly is there. And so there's a back and forth between community perspectives and university research or strategies. Also, it really breaks out of the Lone Ranger model of doing research that we see in the universities so much and creates what is best called a collective CV. So rather than a graduate student, undergraduate, a young faculty member coming into the process and having to establish their reputation, when they associate with great cities or they associate with our Center for Urban Research and Learning, they instantly gain the reputation, gain many of the accomplishments that had been made in the past. So rather than starting from scratch, they could move in and really do research that was really move their careers ahead significantly. And there's also a collaborative work environment reflects the realities of really how policies developed in the first place. There's a lot of give and take between politicians, community activists, there was pressures. All of this was apparent in the Prague model. And also, probably a big thing is within about 2 or 3 years, I know, of setting up the Center for Urban Research and Learning at Loyola, is I started hearing from faculty connected to the center that they got tenure partially because of the work they did for the center. And that kind of support wasn't there before. I remember so many times I'd hear when I was an untenured junior faculty member, well, you know, wait until you're done, wait until you get tenure, or wait until next year. And it's not going to happen if you wait. So this was actually giving support to people early in their careers. And so there's really, in Chicago, there's hundreds of experts in community, in universities that are on call basically to other folks and are available. Just to give you some example of some initial Prague projects, I went back through and looked at some of the things we did, 30 plus years ago. And for example, Chicago Legal Clinic, some of these organizations have, by the way, changed names, but the Chicago Legal Clinic, we provided the research on cumulative contamination of multiple sites in the Calumet region. Kenwood Oakland Community Organization, we worked to enhance links between local residents and who are in need of a job with medical institutions, medical centers in the area. Chicago Women in the Trades, a survey of young girls to determine the interest of in a training workshop that would involve them. Erie Neighborhood House, the creation of career preparation plan for Latinos and assessment of utilization of that program. Galewood Montclair Organization, examination of redlining in that area. Even work with Pembroke farmers near Kankakee. It was a black group of farmers that has been very effective. And basically, and we also did work for the Leadership Council for Metropolitan Open Communities on what produces stable, diverse communities around the U.S. And the study was published as a single, basically a single issue of HUD's journal, Cityscapes, and has been still remains effective. So basically, these various activities have really had impact and a lasting impact. And finally, I'd have to say that it's certainly a need to continue this kind of work and strengthen the collaboration. And really, I'd say now more than ever, given the headwinds we all are facing right now. Thanks.
We're so happy that all of you are here. There are a number of UIC faculty here, including Professor Dick Simpson. I also want to acknowledge that staff is here from Cook County Commissioner Alma Anaya's office. So we always thank the commissioner's support for UIC, and especially as an alum of UIC. I turn now to myself to briefly describe some of the work of the Great Cities Institute. I take very seriously the responsibility for continuing the work of Prague, the Great Cities Initiative, and the Engaged University. Among the many activities, GCI continues the tradition of addressing issues of workforce and economic development, local and regional governance, and community planning. Between 1950 and 2024, Chicago lost, ready for this, 600,000 manufacturing jobs. Now, manufacturing has a high multiplier effect. So not only did we lose those 600,000 jobs, but we lost all those that are generated by manufacturing. One of its impacts is that Chicago continues to grapple with one of the highest youth joblessness rates in the nation, disproportionately affecting Black and Latino communities. GCI has produced a number of reports over the last several years on youth employment, demonstrating the chronic and concentrated character of youth joblessness in the city, region, and state. GCI's latest youth employment report found that in some neighborhoods, over 90% of teens are jobless, reinforcing the need for targeted employment programs, career readiness initiatives, and citywide economic interventions. GCI's research has consistently highlighted the link between youth joblessness, economic mobility, and community safety, emphasizing the need for expanded summer youth employment programs to increase workforce participation, stronger partnerships between schools, community organizations, and employers to create long-term career pipelines, and policy-driven solutions that address racial disparities in job access and income inequality. The GCI Economic and Workforce Development Program landing page was recently made available as a central hub for GCI's research on job creation, workforce training, wage equity, and economic revitalization. This platform highlights ongoing and completed studies that shape policy solutions to address racial and spatial disparities in employment and economic mobility. Recent research examines the Fight for $15 movement, racial inequities in the Paycheck Protection Program, and trends in manufacturing workforce equity. Studies on Amazon's headquarters bids reveals how cities commodify diversity, while analysis of the Manufacturing Extension Partnership explores how improved job quality strengthens industries. Ongoing initiatives include an evaluation of Chai Block Builders, Chicago's vacant land redevelopment program, and continued workforce development studies. GCI served as a key partner in the establishment of the Early Warning Network, a critical initiative designed to provide specialized services to small and mid-sized legacy manufacturing companies and retain industrial jobs in local communities. As part of the advisory committee, GCI helped develop and update the Early Warning Manual. You guys remember the Early Warning Manual from back in the day? The project's primary training tool, ensuring it included guidance on industry management, technical assistance, and ownership succession. We've also done reports on ownership succession. This revised manual was central to the 24-hour pilot training held in fall 2024, where representatives from 13 Chicagoland communities and industrial organizations learned how to identify and assist manufacturers at risk. Through this effort, GCI exemplified its commitment to building stronger communities by helping to preserve high-quality manufacturing firms and the well-paying jobs that they provide. As an example of our work that links economic development issues to neighborhoods, we work with the Lawndale Christian Development Corporation to produce the North Lawndale Services Area Data Book, Strengthening Community Wealth in North Lawndale. North Lawndale residents seek safe streets, good schools, and living wage jobs. But economic leakage, where income leaves the community, hinders wealth building. The Lawndale Services Area Data Book reveals that despite 3,000 new jobs created between 2010 and 2018, most went to non-residents. And $124 million in local spending exits annually to limit businesses and services. GCI's research underscores the need for workforce development, commercial revitalization, and local investment to ensure North Lawndale's and other neighborhoods' economic growth benefits its residents. GCI works directly with communities to produce commercial corridor revitalization plans, community planning frameworks, and quality of life plans. We maintain close relations with our community friends in Humboldt Park and Chicago, South Chicago, in the Calumet region, and will soon embark on a project with West Garfield Park. We have led the participatory budgeting process with city aldermen and with youths in CPS, and currently play a key role in designing and facilitating public engagement activities for the City of Chicago's fiscal year 24 and 25 budget processes. We have co-produced reports with Mujeres Latinas en Acción on gender-based violence, and have an ongoing relationship with the Illinois Legislative Latino Caucus Foundation. We partner with the UIC Freshwater Lab and the Sustainable Engineering Lab to promote treated wastewater for industrial use, rather than tapping into our fresh water supply. We produce data books, conduct evaluations, convene conversations on contemporary urban issues, sponsor and co-sponsor countless events, and host national and international visitors. We have worked with the national government of Ecuador and have a multi-year relationship with VI Albertine and the French attaché in Chicago for higher education. Our work is based on respect, relationships, and rigor as we collaborate and co-produce with dozens of partners. Shout out, by the way, to the Great Cities Institute team. This is just a sample of how the Great Cities Institute today carries through the values of the Policy Research Action Group, lives up to the vision of the Great Cities Initiative, and preserves the ongoing importance of the engaged university. We demonstrate the relevance that is possible through partnerships between universities and among universities and stakeholders to address the many challenges of uneven development, and that our role in universities is as important as ever. Let me turn now to Vim and to Phil for any follow-up points they want to make or add, and then we're going to turn to you who may have questions or brief comments. Thank you.
Yeah, just a couple of quick points I want to make from the perspective of having been a president at two institutions, albeit in another city, where that I think are very relevant for kind of everybody to be aware of. That, you know, as I said, I think one of the motivations for Chancellor Jim Stuckel for coming up with Great Cities was that he needed something to make UIC special and distinct. How was it different from Urbana? But without sort of just saying, well, we're this poor cousin, this poor urban cousin. And I think it really worked to give a clear identity to the university. The same was true for Portland State, which has a tremendous reputation in the city of Portland because of its community engaged work. In fact, when Stuckel was developing his program, he brought in the then president of Portland State to kind of learn from her. So, and it really paid off. The other thing is, and I think Phil, you alluded to this, is that actually having that kind of an identity helps attract the kind of faculty and the kind of students who then carry forward that mission. So, in the beginning, when we started the Great Cities program, there certainly were people around the various tables who thought it was a terrible idea. I remember being at the first meeting of the Dean's Council when I was the special assistant to the Chancellor, and I laid out what this Great Cities was about, and the dean of the medical college, after I was done, sat back and went, and the dean of the business school said, "There's nothing worse than grandiose announcements for mediocre ideas." Well, 3 months later, that dean of the business school used the Great Cities logo on his letterhead, and the dean of the medical school had come to the realization that medicine, by its very nature, was, of course, deeply engaged with the well-being of a city, and that this was not a threat to him, but in fact, it gave his college a new role in a new space. Now, I have to admit that one of the things that we found is that money helps. We got $1 million allocation from the state legislature, and that was back in the early 90s when $1 million still was real money. And the next year, another 600,000. Because in a university, people are always afraid that if you have a good idea, you may take some of his money or her money. But if you come in with your own money, then they'll figure out how they can get some of your money. That works much better. The way, how leading faculty has been compared to herding cats. Well, the way you herd cats is you rattle the food bowl. So that's what we did. We rattled the food bowl. It was possible to attract new people. It facilitates town conflicts, but you got to embed it. It can't just be the chancellor's idea or even just the dean's idea, because as we know, chancellors and presidents come and go. And a lot of people learn, I'll just keep my head down, this too will pass, we'll go on with our work. So by embedding it in institutes and centers, in colleges and in schools and with faculty, you're going to have much more longevity. There's a few more quick points. That in the beginning people say, well, I won't get tenure. I can't take time to work with the community. I need to write stuff that will be in a peer-reviewed journal. Well, be the change that you want to see, right? Start practicing it, and it will create a movement, and that's exactly what happened at our institutions. By doing it, it became legitimate. The other biggest point, of course, is that the land-grant model, while it was a precursor in some ways, it was about the university as the expert, working with the farmer who didn't really know that much, and imparting our knowledge. And in the early days, even here at the university, people would talk about, oh yeah, the city is our laboratory. Well, so I always said, if the city is a laboratory, then the residents apparently are rats. This is not a good metaphor. It's about mutual benefit, joint work, joint production of knowledge. At the same time, it can't just be about the university giving things to the community. If the university doesn't benefit, the faculty don't benefit, the students, then it won't last. People will only do things out of the goodness of their heart for so long. It's got to benefit both sides of it. Two more points. Long-term commitment and resources are essential. You can't do this, because if you do a project and your money runs out and then you don't come back, the community is going to say, why would I invest in working with you? You're going to be gone once the semester or the quarter is over. And then finally, it can't just be about addressing problems or seeing the city as a problem. The city also is a place of joy, of innovation, of creativity, of beauty, and we can't get so caught in our do-gooder efforts that we continually depict the city as just this problematic place that has all these nasty things that need to be solved. No, it's a beautiful place. It's a place that we got to enjoy.
Maybe add a couple of things. One is, people are always impressed with our center at Loyola, how much money we kept on raising, and sort of wanted to know how we did this. And part of it was we worked with community, and there's a whole stream of resources that's available to them, to us through them, that wouldn't have been available to either of us. So really working together made a big, big difference. Also, as much as we want to talk about like structural things that would bring change about, that there are some really key individuals, key leaders. You talk about the past president here, but also with us, it was a dean and an undergraduate dean and graduate dean that were really critical with righting the ship a couple times when our president at that point was wanting to do something just remotely different. And so I think the importance of key leaders at various points, both in the community and the university, is really critical.
Do we have comments or questions from any of you? Because we could talk. We had fun getting together planning this, as you might imagine. But we're welcome to take any questions or comments, or go ahead. Is there a mic where they go? I think they're going to bring you a mic.
I'll just yell.
I think because of recording, I think they want you to have a mic.
I do community engagement in Evanston, and one of the things that we've been talking about a lot is asset-based community development. I guess that was sort of invented there at Northwestern. I work very closely with the university. Just wanted to know how, I'm not very familiar with the concept. So I've read about it. I've never actually leveraged the principles to sort of engage the community on development. And I'd like to know how you guys leverage those principles, or how we can leverage those principles. There's a real town gown situation in Evanston.
Yeah.
I'm sure you guys understand that.
So I'll take it real quickly, and then you all can respond. So very often, people begin with a kind of deficit model, and the idea is that instead of talking about what people don't have, talk about what they do have, and then you take what they have and you build on that. So one of the ways that we do that at Great Cities when we're doing visioning is we start out by asking people what they view as some of the assets of their community, and what they feel are some of the ways in which they want to build on those assets. And I think that's sort of how you do it. So you don't want to necessarily be unrealistic about what are some of the issues, because part of what you want to do is address the issues. But it really comes from the framework, and it's related to what you all were saying about, because the first and foremost asset people have is their experience, right? And the knowledge of their community and the knowledge of what's important to them. So it's not coming in with an attitude of people who are helping know what's best and we're going to tell you what's best. It's more like, okay, building from that knowledge. Simultaneously, though, I always make the point, because sometimes we might go overboard and say, well, we're a blank slate and we'll just let the community tell us everything. It's like, well, part of my response to that is, if you have nothing to offer, then stay home. It's like, you want to, if you call a plumber and ask a plumber to come and fix, he doesn't come with the toolbox and asks you, well, what do you think I should do, right? So, you've got to show up with the toolbox, you've got to show up with something offer, but like any other offering, you offer it graciously. And you build on and you begin by assessing by asking for their assessment of the situation. So that's some of what's involved in that.
I even think things like, things like surveys.
In the back right there.
People always want to do a survey to figure out what's going on. Well, partially, there's expertise of surveys in universities. And what happens, though, when the community and the universities work together, the community starts understanding what surveys are about, what the pros and cons are, and they gain expertise in the process of doing the first project. The second project, they're more sophisticated in knowing what to do. So I think that's really, really critical. And I think there's resources in the community that academics are unaware of, and vice versa. And I think that comes out the more one collaborates with the other.
That's a really good point, because part of what you also do is you build capacity. So we've done work where we're co-producing and building people's capacity to sort of lead the questionnaire construction and then to actually implement it. So there's more questions.
Yes, I'd like to address this to Vim and want to know if he wants to apologize for the harm that UIC did to Maxwell Street in Pilsen.
No.
There's that answer. Back over here, there was a question. The hand, and then we're winding up. Just to, while you're walking over there, I think the question was asked and answered. But as a little bit of context, part of during this period, Vim mentioned, for example, the creation of UIC and the use of urban renewal, national federal programs, urban renewal, to displace people. And it wasn't just Italians that were displaced, but a very large And if the first Mexican community was also displaced. In fact, where we are sits where there was a very vibrant commercial corridor for Mexicans. So this, and I think Professor Perry wrote a lot about sort of university as anchor institutions. And so that relationship between universities and towns, universities and communities has so many dimensions to it. And I think part of what becomes important about the initiative that Great Cities had, even being aware of its own history in its birth and in its expansion, was like how, there's the value of education, and then there's the value of like, how can we be better neighbors? And one of the things that Stuckel did during that time is he took down, like he told me, I forget how many tons of concrete from this campus, much to the chagrin of many brutalist architecture fans, but we literally had, UIC was fenced, was walled off, literally. This whole campus was surrounded by a concrete wall, and there were concrete overhangs. And one of the things he did during that period is he removed that so that we could be more open, more friendly, and more available. And then finally, I just want to add for the, in terms of UIC, in terms of the students that we serve, it's our students that we are serving here at UIC. This is very much an urban university with a very, very diverse range of students who come here. So,
and just to add to that, if I may, the urban renewal projects took place in the early 60s, long before certainly I came to UIC, and even during all the subsequent years, of course, I was a special assistant and became the dean of the college. I was not in charge of the real estate developments of the university. In fact, I do remember one chancellor at one point telling me we had a grant from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and we passed a lot of the money on to groups like 18th Street Development Corporation and groups on the Near West Side. And I remember at one point, not Jim Stuckel, but a later chancellor, telling me, you're passing on all this, you're funding these people who are pissing on my shoes every day. And I said, well, yeah, those are the dilemmas of working in a big city. Yeah. And we got to accept that.
Our last question, unfortunately, so we can stay on schedule. Yes, sir.
Thank you, and I appreciate the expansion for the answer, because I do appreciate the question and how community or university development impacts community. So that's very much appreciative. I helped found some of the work currently going on in West Garfield Park, and it was centered around QLP work. I'm now in South Shore doing QLP work, and when you examine all of the QLPs being done in community, they are very, very similar, right? In terms of the needs, in terms of the wants, in terms of what we want to see in economic development, education, et cetera. So as you all examine the region, the Chicago or Greater Chicagoland region in particular, how do you see communities being able to work together and identifying certain sectors or specialties that communities can hone in on versus being in what seems like a constant competition with one another to attract the same type of investment, the same type of development, the same type of industry, right? So I want to know from what you all have seen, how can we work in a more integrated, collaborative, cooperative fashion? And are there particular things that you can identify that we can do without, or at least minimizing, how much we step on each other's toes?
You asked a very simple question at the end of our time here. I feel like we could spend the rest of the day addressing your question. I really appreciate its importance. I will say something briefly about it, and then you gentlemen may want to add something, and then we'll wrap it up. Everything that it really truly is a great question. Everything that we had done, for example, when we did our youth joblessness report, or when we did the fracturing of gangs report, we talked about the importance of neighborhood development. And one of the things that's really great is that we are seeing more resources being put into neighborhoods. So I want to call out attention of at least a couple, for example, that I think get at some of what you're saying. One is the Chicago Community Trust has its We Rise program. And there's a lot of funding that they have made available, and in the course of their work in this program that's extended over several years, they bring together multiple organizations to share information, resources, and strategies. So I think that's an example. We're seeing some of that. The Chicago Prize from the Pritzker Foundation is another example of making more resources available, but in the course of that, bringing organizations together. So I think you also call attention to the fact that there still obviously needs to be even more of that. So hopefully this is something that Urban Forum helps provide. There'll be some contacts here, but it's something even for great cities to think about some more. We used to do some of that before where we had the Urban Fellows, and maybe it's something we should resurrect again to help increase the cross-collaboration among community groups so they can share resources and strategies and find ways to support one another even more than they already do. So thank you for the question. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think we're over time, but
Yeah.
thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, so thank you all very much. Have a wonderful day. We really, thank you, Joe. Thank you for all the organizers. We really appreciate it.
All right. I'm going to move us along to the next part of the program. I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Juan Gonzalez, who's yes, thank you. Juan Gonzalez, who is currently a senior research fellow at the Great Cities Institute here at UIC. Mr. Gonzalez was a staff columnist for the New York's The Daily News for nearly 30 years and has been a co-host since 1996 of the morning news show Democracy Now! And was Richard D. Hefner Professor of Communications and Public Policy at Rutgers University from 2017 to 2023. He is also one of the founders and a past president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Gonzalez's investigative reports on the labor movement, environmental justice, race relations, and urban policy have garnered him numerous accolades, including 2 George Polk Awards for commentary, and in 2015, he was the first Latino to be inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame by the Society of Professional Journalists Deadline Club. He's the author of 5 books, including a classic, Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, the basis of an award-winning 2012 feature documentary film in which he narrated. Also, he's author of News for All the People, The Epic Story of Race and the American Media, co-authored with Joseph Torres, and several other books, including the Reclaiming Gotham, Bill de Blasio, and the Movement to End America's Tale of Two Cities. Over the years, more than 24 films and documentaries have featured Gonzalez as a figure or expert commentator, including the landmark series, PBS series, Latino Americans, among several others. He was born in Puerto Rico, raised in New York City's East Harlem, received his BA from Columbia University. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Juan Gonzalez.
Good afternoon, everyone. My thanks to Dean White and Joe Horace and the UIC Urban Forum for inviting me to share some words with you today at this gathering, which seeks every year to examine and celebrate innovative examples of engagement and partnership between UIC faculty, students, and local Chicago communities. I confess to being somewhat intimidated by this task, given that I am relatively new to both UIC and the Chicago area, having joined Great Cities Institute as a research fellow a little more than 2 years ago, and given that my entire life has been spent on the East Coast, mostly New York City or Philadelphia, which is to say, I'm learning my way still around Chicago, and certainly don't have the kind of rich experience with community engagement here that this previous panel, Vin Wyvil, Phil Knighton, and Teresa Cordova have, and their eloquent summaries of the work that has been done by this university. In that short time that I've been here, though, under the leadership of our fearless Teresa Cordova, GCI has provided me a wonderful home and a marvelous chance to turn my investigative reporting skills into research studies that are of immediate use to marginalized communities. Among them, an October 2023 report on the U.S. migrant crisis and the impact of U.S. foreign policy on the migrant surges of recent years to this country, and a September 2024 study in partnership with 6 community organizations titled Fuerza Mexicana, the Past, Present, and Power of Mexicans in Chicagoland. And these are just a small part of the extensive research work GCI does in collaboration with community, civic, and educational groups that Teresa has enumerated in the previous panel. I am no stranger, however, to the topic of university community engagement and sometimes university community conflict. Thus, my remarks today, which I have titled Community Engagement in Troubled Times, will be peppered with references to some of my own personal experiences. As you've heard, I was a professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University for 7 years before arriving here, taught it as well at Brooklyn College and New York University, and have written a couple of history books that remain popular in many college classes. But I've always considered myself more a journalist. I've always considered myself more of a journalist and an incurable radical activist than a teacher or historian, having devoted more than 40 years now to chronicling daily events in urban politics, the economy, crime, law enforcement, race relations, occasionally war and conflicts abroad. What we in our profession typically refer to as hard news. In short, I've been fortunate to earn my living bearing witness to thousands of events, big and small, interviewing the famous, the infamous, and the little known, then trying to explain often complex subjects in a way that makes sense to a broader public. And I have had the chance to do so from within the 3 distinct and separate streams of the press in America: the corporate or commercial for-profit media, having worked as a reporter on mainstream newspapers for decades, including 29 years as a Metro columnist at the New York Daily News, but also with the alternative, non-commercial or progressive media as co-host since 1996 with Amy Goodman of the radio television show Democracy Now!, and also with the ethnic or minority press that was formed by journalists of color who for so long were excluded or marginalized by those other 2 streams. I edited for several years in the 1980s, for example, a bilingual Spanish language, bilingual newspaper in North Philadelphia's Latino community. Over all those decades, I reported not only on international events and never-ending partisan battles at the national, state, and local level between candidates and political parties, but on subjects and issues at the local level that rarely generate sufficient attention. Grassroots efforts by ordinary citizen groups to improve neighborhoods, conditions in the workplace and in their schools, policing among people of color, and especially urban land policy. My comments are thus shaped through the dual lens of both a journalist and a longtime activist, and they will attempt to sketch a broader view of the status of academic community engagement today at public universities and higher education institutions. Given the deeply troubling, divisive, and unprecedented times in which we find ourselves, such a broader picture cannot be shied away from. Should some in the audience find aspects of my remarks a little stark, please accept them as food for thought and discussion. You see, most of us are accustomed to a slow, dull, almost plodding pace to our lives, where things don't change that much from day to day, and where past practice routinely guides what we will do tomorrow, and where almost everything is predictable. But then we're hit with a sudden upheaval, or a crisis, a calamity we never expected, the loss of a loved one or a job, a war or massive civil strife that can stamp our brains forever, that can propel us onto unexpected paths, awaken emotions we never knew we had, and dramatically alter how we see the world. Such a moment transpired for myself and many Latinx and Black youth of my generation during a few pivotal years in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And one of our panelists referred to part of that moment. In April of 1968, in the midst of the Vietnam War, and only weeks after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, sparking racial disorders in more than 100 US cities, I and hundreds of other Columbia University undergraduates sat in and barricaded several buildings on our campus, supported by the most visionary of neighborhood leaders, to oppose Columbia's arrogant seizure of Harlem Parkland for a university expansion project, a gymnasium, and demanded that Columbia professors stop doing research for the Pentagon's Institute for Defense Analysis in support of the war. Hundreds of us were arrested during weeks of sit-ins, during which I somehow emerged as one of the strike leaders and ended up being suspended from Columbia only days before my scheduled graduation. A moment that certainly shocked my family, my being on a full scholarship, the first person in my family to go to college, the son of working-class Puerto Rican parents. But the university soon conceded, canceled the expansion project, cut its defense research, fired its president and its provost, and even created something we never asked for, a more democratic governance structure for the entire university. Shortly afterward, as a founder and leader of the Puerto Rican group, the Young Lords, we and other community activists achieved the first Puerto Rican, Black, and other ethnic studies programs at several campuses of the City University of New York, just as other communities were doing so with other universities across the country. Few students and young professors currently involved in these programs today have any idea that virtually none of those courses or the scholarly research on which they depend even existed a mere 50 years ago. Nor do they realize that the very creation of these disciplines only came about as a reluctant concession by the nation's academic institutions to massive social turmoil during the late 1960s. That turmoil began in the streets and the working-class neighborhoods of our inner cities, but it quickly morphed into a social movement aimed especially at democratizing access to higher education. US campuses back then were largely all white preserves of the privileged strata, and that movement proceeded to challenge the very content and purpose of knowledge production in a modern capitalist society. More than half a century later, conservative opponents of that movement have not relented in their efforts to roll back the reforms it generated. We who participated in the formative years of this educational revolution always regarded the preservation of our community's history not simply as a way to expand and enrich the lexicon of academia. We saw it as a means to achieve a more just world. That approach soon spread beyond just ethnic studies and affirmative action policies under increasing pressure from their surrounding communities The more enlightened leaders of our universities gradually acknowledged that their institutions could not remain isolated and apart from the neighborhoods in which they were located, that they could not simply continue to bulldoze and gentrify inner-city neighborhoods to make way for new classrooms, dormitories, and research laboratories without giving something back. Many colleges began in subsequent decades to adopt a more collaborative approach, to work with local community leaders on important studies around public health, criminal justice, affordable housing, improving schools, economic development, immigration policy, and climate change. They moved to partner with their neighbors, not simply use them as research subjects or guinea pigs with which to train their medical students. As a result, the decades of work done by many professors at public universities, especially here at CUPA and great cities and other units of UIC, have been exemplary. But much of our progress is now directly threatened. We are once again living through a seminal moment of unexpected upheaval, where the very role of higher education, of a public university, its relationship to government, to the corporate world, to its surrounding neighborhoods, is being transformed before our very eyes. This time, with virtually no say from students, faculty, or local residents, even administrators, the main stakeholders of these institutions. Edward Said, the great Columbia University professor, literary critic, and political activist, in the last of his many books, Humanism and Democratic Criticism, praised the American university as a unique institution. It is, Said wrote, and I quote him, the one public space available to real alternative intellectual practices. No other institution like it on such a scale exists anywhere in the world. That book was published barely a decade ago. How quickly things change. In less than 2 years, scores of universities across the country have called police on campus to arrest student protest encampments. New rules restricting public meetings and political speech have sprouted almost overnight. Congressional committees in Washington have interrogated and threatened elite college presidents, demanding they fire dissident faculty and expel students engaging in peaceful dissent without even due process. Wealthy donors at private universities have forced the removal of a handful of school presidents. The removal of a handful of school presidents, the donors consider too liberal or too weak on anti-Semitism. Federal agencies have summarily canceled hundreds of millions of dollars in university research contracts and threatened to cancel billions more in health and sciences field and even in the humanities for schools supposedly guilty of placing undue emphasis on programs of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Immigration authorities have arrested and detained a small but growing number of foreign graduate students, canceled their green cards or student visas, marked them for deportation, while hundreds of thousands of undocumented immigrant students go to class each day in fear that they or their mother or father or sister may soon be picked up by promised federal sweeps and be deported. The liberal idea of academic freedom, in short, is being rapidly replaced by a type of outright tyranny on college campuses, one that emanates not from within, but from outside these campuses, from the nation's powerful elite in a repressive assault that can only be compared to the notorious McCarthy period of the 1950s. This time, however, the poor and working class communities that in the 1960s and 1970s exerted such a powerful counterforce for academic reform are mostly silent. Why is that? Haven't the universities, especially the public ones, dramatically opened their doors in recent decades to more students of color and working class kids? Don't scores of urban schools routinely showcase their legal clinics, their health fairs, and medical services in minority neighborhoods, their collaborations with community groups on equity issues and cutting-edge research? Well, some critics of the evolution of university governance note that even as many colleges promoted their community engagement partnerships, the dominant neoliberal operating model of the modern university was operating at cross purposes to the social and community engagement approach of even the classic ivory tower scholarship approach of the past. That the administrative business model was creating powerful new levers for outside hijacking of a university's mission. More than 15 years ago, the pioneering cultural critic Henry Giroux warned that, and I quote, "While American universities still employs the rhetoric of a democratic public sphere, there is a growing gap between a stated belief in noble purposes and the reality of an academy that is under siege." In a 2009 essay, which he titled "Democracy's Nemesis: The Rise of the Corporate University," Giroux went on to say, and I really recommend that essay for anyone who wants to look a little deeper into this, and I quote Giroux, "Higher education is increasingly abandoning its role as a democratic public sphere as it aligns itself with corporate power and market values. Instead of being a space of critical dialogue, analysis, and interpretation, it is increasingly defined as a space of consumption, where ideas are validated in instrumental terms and valued for their success in attracting corporate and government funding." So we have this tension in many of our universities between the laudable and important work that groups like GCI and CAPA are doing and the model of the corporate university that seeks more government funding and more private donations. The bottom line: cost centers, eds and meds, branding, corporate sponsorships, naming rights. These are some of the all too familiar lingo of the modern university, whether public or private. Despite that disturbing business trend, valuable and important work of community engagement, research, and policy development continues to be accomplished by professors and students. Unfortunately, as universities increasingly came to depend on the private sector and government research contracts to bolster their finances, they also made themselves more susceptible to pressure from those donors and the federal government, and now they are facing the reality of what happens when those federal contracts are pulled. Similar repressive actions are already looming in our nation's public school system as well, with all the school districts required recently by the U.S. Department of Education to certify within the next few days that they are eliminating any of what the department labels discriminatory diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, or they will face cutoff of federal funds. Many of these federal cuts are likely illegal, as is the targeting of dissident foreign students for detention, withdrawal of their visas, and ordering their deportation. But while individual court challenges wind their way slowly through our judicial system, the fear and uncertainty provoked by these actions are already causing irreparable harm to every university and school district in the country. There is no way to escape the reality that we are in the midst of the worst crisis in public education anyone can recall. Simply relying on the legal system to fix things will have little effect when even the highest officials in our land seem determined to ignore the law. And ignoring the crisis or going about business as usual is to betray all of what we teach our students about how popular movements and marginalized groups in the past had to courageously fight to expand democracy and social justice. Rather, it is time for the main stakeholders in public education, the students, the faculty, the staff members, the parents, and administrators to band together in a united effort, in collaboration, to defend and preserve our democratic education system. Teachers should hopefully be spreading the word to their students, administrators to their local communities and civic leaders. This assault should be resisted by any means available. As Giroux warned, and I leave you with this quote, higher education has a deeper responsibility, not only to search for the truth, regardless of where it may lead, but also to educate students to make authority politically and morally accountable, and to expand both academic freedom and the possibility and promises of the university as a bastion of democratic inquiry, values, and politics. And as Vin just said, we have to be the change we want to see. Thank you.
We will now take a 15-minute break. Please feel free to grab some coffee and refreshments, and we'll be back shortly with our second panel. Thank you.